Hey, what's going on, guys? Rim Gaming here, back with another video. In today's episode, we're going to be doing a bot lane guide for Caitlyn. So Caitlyn is a high-ranged AD carry known for her incredible early game pressure, superior wave clear, and her strong kiting potential. So in this guide, we're going to break down her abilities, recommended runes, itemization, and some advanced tips to help you dominate the Rift as Caitlyn. Let's do a quick overview of her ability. So her passive is Headshot, so every few basic attacks, or when attacking a trapped or netted enemy, Caitlyn will fire a headshot, dealing a whole bunch of bonus damage, scaling with critical strike. So a few tips on this passive is targets hit by traps or nets have double the attack range for headshots. So if somebody is at a rather far range and they end up stepping on one of your traps, you basically turn into a sniper and you shoot them from basically double the distance. And then another tip on this is headshots actually stack twice as quickly while you're in a brush. So typically when you are trading with your lane opponent, you want to make sure that you're getting in the brush as much as you can to get double the stacks of your headshot. Now going into her Q ability, the Piltover Peacemaker is a charged, penetrating shot that's dealing high physical damage, but with reduced damage on subsequent targets. So typically this is used for long range poke or wave clear. And typically in the late game, this is not going to be an ability that you're really relying on quite as much. You'll be more focused on your auto attacks. This does have a small cast time associated with it, so you are pretty vulnerable while you are using it. So more of an early to mid game ability. You can still use it in the late game, obviously, just be careful with it. Up next, she has her W ability, the Yordle Snap Trap. This is going to immobilize enemies for 1.5 seconds, reveal them, and this will also grant a headshot. And then for your traps, you're going to be using these to control key areas like a jungle entrance, an objective, any sort of brushes. And then you can also use these kind of as something to fall back on. So as enemies are pursuing you, you can fall back onto your traps and use them almost as a barrier so they have to go around them. Or of course, if they step on it, you get the bonus damage. Then her E ability, the 90 caliber net. This is going to slow the target. It's going to shoot a net at him and then it's going to launch Caitlyn backwards. And you can use this to reposition or escape over walls. And then you can combine this with headshot to quickly stack a whole bunch of damage and help secure trades. And then finally, we have our ultimate Ace in the Hole. So this is a single target ultimate with very massive range that can be blocked by other champions. So you want to use this for the most part to execute low health champions, or you can use this to pressure squishy targets, especially if you do get a slight lead in lane. This actually does quite a bit of damage to high health targets. So this can just further pressure your enemy and give you even more of a lane advantage. And then you can also pair this with Farsight Alteration to help maintain vision of any sort of targets hiding in brushes. Then you do not want to be using this ability in any sort of trades or team fights just because it has a long animation. Okay, let's take a quick look at Rune Setup. So the primary tree is going to be Precision, and we'll be taking Fleet Footwork, Presence of Mind, Legend, Bloodline, and Coup de Grace. So Fleet Footwork is going to provide sustained mobility in lane. Presence of Mind is going to keep our mana topped up for ability usage. Legend Bloodline is going to grant us lifesteal for survivability. Then Coup de Grace is going to enhance damage against low health targets. The secondary tree we're going to be running is Sorcery. So Gathering Storm, this is going to boost our late game scaling with AD. And Absolute Focus, this is going to improve the execution damage with a high health target. Now, as an alternative, if you need sustain, you could consider Inspiration with Biscuit Delivery for healing and, potentially magical footwear for the free boots. All right, let's talk about itemization now. So the core build is going to be the Collector or Infinity Edge. You can start either based on preference. So the Collector is going to be better for early game snowball potential, and then Infinity Edge is going to be cool for scaling with any sort of crit-based build. Then Rapid Fire Cannon is very good on Caitlyn because she already has a long range, so this is going to extend that range even further. And then Lord Dominic's Regards will help us counter tanks with bonus armor penetration. Now there are some sort of utility and survivability options. We could go Scimitar for any sort of crowd control effects. If you do need more sustain, you could go something like Bloodthirster in the shield for survivability. You can also go Immortal Shield Bow. That's going to give us some great survivability as well. You could also build a Hurricane if you need any sort of like AoE crit attacks for team fights. If you're against a whole bunch of like melee players who are all kind of grouping up, a Hurricane can be pretty strong because you can really cleave down a bunch of people at once, especially once you get your build rolling. And then for additional wave clear utility, you could go a Static Shiv. All right, let's talk about laning phase. So the main thing you're going to be focused on in laning phase is harassing the enemy with your auto attacks and last hitting minions. So Caitlyn's long range does help with this. And then you can also stack headshots in the brush, kind of like we talked about earlier, for some surprise damage. And then you do want to use your snap traps generally to zone off any sort of lane that might be ganking you. You know, somewhere in the jungle, anywhere there's a gap around you, you can line up 2 or 3 traps. That's going to make it a little bit more difficult for the jungler to path towards you. That's going to buy you a few more seconds to escape. Now, as the game does sort of progress, in team fights, what you're looking to do is you're looking to focus auto attacks to essentially just maximize your DPS instead of relying on any sort of abilities like your Q. So Piltover, Peacemaker, or Ace in the Hole, you in a chaotic fight, you kind of want to hold off on using those, to be honest, and you're typically using Ace in the Hole for an execute. So in a team fight, you're really focused on using your traps and your net and just kind of kiting back with the rest of your team. So some of her synergies, right? She really excels with engaged tanks like a Leona, a Braum, a Thresh, or even a Blitzcrank. And this is really strong because Caitlyn is an early aggression sort of ADC. You want somebody who can go in and fight for you, and then late game, somebody who can kind of peel for you as well. And then if you are wanting to be extremely aggressive in the early game, she's also pretty good with poke mages, such as like a Brand or a Vel'Koz. So if you're really wanting to punish the enemy laner, you're going to want to pick a mage to go in the lane with you. However, they cannot peel for you quite as well in the late game. And Caitlyn typically doesn't do as well with sustained focus support, so something like a Soraka or a Janet. Again, what you really want to be focusing on is dominating your lane phase as Caitlyn. Now let's just talk about some of the overall pros and cons of playing Caitlyn. So obviously her exceptional range, like we talked about, she can really bully the laners in the early game phase. And she also has great wave clear. She can just line up her Q and take out a wave pretty easily. So she's very strong in the early game. She's not quite as strong in the mid game, but she becomes very strong again in the late game. And that's just due to her headshot passive and how she scales with critical strike. She just does a ton of damage late game. You pair that with her kiting potential and a couple tanks that can kind of peel for you, and you have a very strong champion. And then one of the disadvantages of Caitlyn is in the late game, her abilities don't scale super well. Her Q has a long animation, her ultimate has a long animation, and for the most part, you're just going to be relying on your auto attacks and your kiting potential. All right, guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We'll see you on the next one.